All right, lecture number 16, we're continuing our story of the monthly cycling that occurs in females. So we've talked about the 28-day cycle and that occurs in the ovaries and how it's hormonally regulated. And now we're going to see what's going on at the same time in the uterus. And the cycling that occurs during each 28-day period in the female is called the uterine or the menstrual cycle. Okay, so again, your uterine cycle is referring to these changes in the endometrium, the inner lining of the uterus. And so in the ovarian cycle, you had 2 phases. The uterine cycle has 3 phases, and they're guided by these fluctuating ovarian hormone levels that we've already discussed. So days 1 through 5, that's actually considered to be the menstrual phase. That's when a woman is experiencing her period or menstruation. That's where the endometrial lining that was generated the previous month is sloughed off. So this has to be recreated each month to make sure that it's healthy and is producing good, nutritious fluids for an embryo if it attaches. So it has to be recreated each month. So the uterine cycle actually starts each month with a woman's menstrual period. So day 1 of her menstrual period is day 1 of the uterine cycle. That's going to correspond to what's going on in the ovaries, the early part of the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle. As your FSH and LH levels are coming up, they're rising and beginning to stimulate those changes in the follicles that we discussed in the last video lecture. All right, so after day 5, the woman's menstrual period is over. Yes, I know there are some differences in how long that can last from female to female. Roughly days 6 through 14 in the uterus. This is called the proliferative phase or the pre-ovulatory phase. That's referring to ovulation. All right, so days 6 through 14, a new endometrial lining is being created with glands, secretory glands that are going to produce a nourishing fluid. You have to have a very rich blood supply that grows into the new lining, so you need new blood vessels to be produced. And so that's occurring roughly from days 6 through 14. Day 14, ovulation takes place, and this is where you have, this is almost always 14 days in females, corresponding to days 15 through 28 of the cycle. It's called the secretory phase, and that's secretion of nourishing fluids. All right, so if an embryo attaches, implants in the endometrium along that lining, it's going to need lots of nourishment, and so the endometrial lining is secreting that nourishment in case an embryo attaches. All right, if no embryo attaches, then you go back to day 1 of the next cycle. You go through the menstrual period, the endometrial lining gets sloughed off, and you start the whole thing over again. All right, this graph is showing you is a reminder of the changes in the levels of estrogens and progesterone, these ovarian hormones. Let's see, this will be day 1, day 14, day 28. So in blue over here, this was the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle, and this is your luteal phase. So this is where ovulation takes place. And as we discussed on the last video lecture, estrogen levels gradually rise as the follicles have been stimulated, and those thecal cells and granulosa cells are cooperating to produce more estrogens. Estrogen levels go up. Then after ovulation, they drop back down pretty quickly. The corpus luteum forms right after ovulation, and so you start seeing a very fast increase in progesterone levels, and the corpus luteum also makes some estrogen, so those levels stay up high. If no pregnancy occurs, the corpus luteum dies, and so you see a rapid decrease in estrogen and progesterone production. Okay, so those hormones, the levels of those hormones are also going to be guiding the uterine cycle, uh, just as they guide the ovarian cycle. All right, so what's happening during the menstrual phase, days 1 through 5? This is where the endometrial lining from the previous cycle gets shed off. So your ovarian hormones are at their lowest levels. Those are your estrogens and progesterone. The gonadotropins, FSH and LH, their levels are beginning to rise, so they're going to stimulate the start of a new ovarian cycle. So that's happening up in the ovaries. Down here in the uterus, the stratum functionalis, that is, all right, so the endometrium is divided up into two sublayers. One of those is called the stratum functionalis. The other one is called the stratum basalis. And the stratum basalis stays in place. It doesn't get shed off. It's the innermost, no, the outer, the most superficial portion of the endometrium that's facing the lumen of the uterus is what gets shed off each month. And this takes about 3 to 5 days to occur. By day 5, your growing ovarian follicles are producing estrogen. So estrogen levels are starting to rise. And so we're going to move into the next phase of the uterine cycle. Days 6 through 14, that's called the proliferative phase. Okay, so estrogen is important for triggering a new stratum functionalis layer of the endometrium to develop. Okay, so again, that's your most superficial sublayer of the endometrium that's facing the lumen of the uterus. After day 14, your progesterone levels are going to start increasing. So what's going to happen here is the tissues of the stratum functionalis become responsive to progesterone. They start making progesterone receptors and get ready to respond to the progesterone that the corpus luteum is going to make. There are glands in the stratum functionalis. So these are the ones that secrete nourishing fluids. They enlarge and get ready to start making that fluid. And spiral arteries, these bring in an oxygen-rich blood supply into this new stratum functionalis that's developing there. All right, estrogen stimulates the cervical mucus that forms the plug over the external os, the opening into the cervix. These estrogens thin that out, and that allows sperm to pass. And this is the time of the cycle when you want that to happen, because ovulation is going to happen right around day 14. All right, then finally, days 15 through 28. This is the most constant time-wise. So it's 14 days in almost every female. The endometrium is preparing for an embryo to attach, just in case. And progesterone is the key hormone here. So it tells those glands that developed, that estrogen stimulated those glands to develop. Progesterone causes them to become secretory. They start producing these nourishing fluids. And also progesterone thickens the cervical. It stimulates a thickening of the cervical mucus again so that it plugs up the external os. And that's another safeguard to prevent more than one fertilization from occurring during each ovarian and uterine cycle. All right, then as we talked about, if fertilization does not occur, the corpus luteum is going to degenerate. About 10 days after ovulation, those progesterone levels plummet, as we saw on the graph earlier. The endometrial cells begin to die, the ones that are in the stratum functionalis. The glands regress, they die. The spiral arteries, these are little tiny arteries that are providing a blood supply to the stratum functionalis. They generate a rush of blood flow. And what this rush of blood flow does is it overwhelms capillaries the tiniest blood vessels of the stratum functionalis, those capillaries die. So this stratum functionalis, this functional layer, dies and it sloughs off. And that's when the bleeding begins of the menstrual period. This is a pretty good diagram from your textbook, which is showing the changes. So this is a graph of the endometrial lining. All right, so here's your basal layer, your stratum basalis down in here, and this is supposed to represent the thickness and the changes in the functional layer, the stratum functionalis. So they're showing you days 1 through 5. This is when a menstrual flow is taking place, the menstrual period. So the functional layer gets much thinner. And during the proliferative phase, so from roughly day 5 to day 14, this is controlled mainly by estrogen. You have a thickening of the endometrial lining, so lots of mitosis, growth of tissues. Here are the spiral arteries that are growing in there to provide a rich blood supply. In yellow, you see here, those are the secretory glands that are going to produce the nourishing fluids for the developing embryo. After ovulation, which occurs right there, you enter this secretory phase, and this is largely controlled by progesterone. Progesterone is suppressing the uterus from contracting. Don't forget that as well. That prevents expulsion of this endometrial lining in case an embryo attaches. And notice these glands become even larger and functional. They're producing a nourishing fluid. So if a little embryo attaches over here, it has a source of nutrients. If no embryo attaches, there's no pregnancy that occurs. Boom. Progesterone levels plummet. Estrogen levels plummet. Without progesterone, the uterus will start to contract, the smooth muscle will contract, and you start the menstrual flow over here. You start over with a new uterine cycle. Your textbook has, and I didn't put them in the PowerPoint because it would have been so small it would have been difficult to see, but your textbook has very nice diagrams where it lined up together. You can see the changes along a timeline that occur with the ovarian cycle, and then it's lined up at the same time with the changes that are going on along the endometrium as part of the uterine cycle, and then you can also see the fluctuations in the hormones that are taking place. So that would be a really good diagram to take a careful look at and make sure you understand what's going on during these processes. All right, what is menopause? Menopause, a woman is officially in menopause when menses, those are menstrual periods, have ceased for an entire year. There is no equivalent to menopause in males. Males will continue to produce sperm well into their 70s and even 80s, maybe even older, although aging does reduce their numbers and sometimes they don't swim as well. In females, menopause results in declining estrogen levels. Okay, if you're not stimulating development of follicles, these follicles produce estrogens. So without development of the follicles, estrogen levels are going to drop dramatically. And this is going to lead to atrophy of the reproductive organs and the breasts, so they're going to decrease in size. Can cause irritability and depression in some women. Estrogens certainly have impacts on the brain, and so it's thought that in some women that can lead to depression. Hot flashes can occur. That's due to intense periods of vasodilation that occur when a female is going through menopause and having some of these fluctuations in hormones occurring. Gradual thinning of the skin and bone loss. Estrogen is necessary for stimulating mitosis in the skin, maintenance of the skin tissues. Bone loss, you learned about that when you studied the skeletal system in Biology 201. Estrogen seems to reduce activity of the osteoclast, your bone dissolving cells. And so when estrogen levels decline, osteoclasts seem to become overactive and they degrade too much bone. They're doing that. They're supposed to do that to help you maintain calcium homeostasis. But if they're overactive and they're overaggressive about that in the absence of estrogen, then that can lead to excessive breakdown of bony tissues, which can lead to osteoporosis. And declining estrogen levels after menopause, that's associated with an increase in total blood cholesterol and falling HDL. So levels of the good cholesterol tend to decline. Okay, that's finally going to lead us to fertilization to implantation. What happens if a sperm cell does actually find a secondary oocyte that's hanging out in a fallopian tube or working its way down a fallopian tube? That's when fertilization occurs. And so lecture number 17, we're going to talk about what happens from fertilization to the time that an embryo actually implants in the endometrium. We also need to talk about, well, what is it that tells the corpus luteum to stay alive? So the corpus luteum doesn't die if fertilization takes place. And as we'll see, there's a hormonal signal that is sent from the early embryo that is forming that acts on the corpus luteum and says, hey, you need to stay alive and keep cranking out progesterone and estrogens to maintain the pregnancy. And then later the placenta takes over for that, as we'll see. So we'll pick up there for lecture number 17. And that's actually going to be moving to chapter 28. We are not going to cover nearly as much detail in chapter 28 as we did for chapter 27. We're just going to be hitting some highlights on what happens from fertilization and forward from there through delivery of an infant. But those will be the topics for chapter 28 in the last few video lectures for Unit 5.